Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Philosophy of X here on the Aspect Network. I'm your host, Alex Batts, and I'll be your guide as we take a journey to examine the world of X-Men through philosophy. We are back to our regularly scheduled programming. We've got all of our interlude episodes out of the way, and we are finally on the other side of our 3-part character exploration of Magneto. If you haven't, please be sure to go check out the past episodes for my thoughts on both X-Men 97 and also the Magneto deep dive. While I had a great time going super in-depth on Magneto, as I've said, he's one of my favorite mutants, I am very much looking forward to, hopefully, keeping the rest of these episodes single parts to be more digestible for you all. I'm going to aim for them to be around that 15 to 20 minute sweet spot, but some might be slightly longer or shorter, so we'll see how it shakes out. As you can tell by the title, this week we're talking about another one of the most iconic X-Men, Jean Grey. To say that Jean has a complicated history is a massive understatement. Again, you'll notice that's going to be a running theme through most of the X-Men. She, like a lot of X-Men characters, have an intense history of retcons on top of retcons. Again, for those that don't know, retcon is shorthand for retroactive continuity. In other words, it's a story reveal that changes or alters pre-existing continuity that's been established. Jean is a walking retcon. The nature of Jean and her many retcons are actually what make her a perfect candidate for today's philosophical topic of choice, the philosophy of personal identity. But before we dive into the philosophy, I'll give a quick breakdown on who Jean Grey is and her most important character beats. Let's dive in. Jean Grey, also known as Marvel Girl or Phoenix, was the youngest daughter of Elaine Grey and Professor John Grey. When Jean was 10 years old, she was playing with her best friend who was accidentally hit by a car. The stress awakened Jean's mutant telepathic powers, which empathetically linked her to her dying friend. This traumatic experience left Jean in a withdrawn and deeply depressed state. On top of this, not being able to control her newly awakened telepathic abilities forced her to isolate herself from other people in order to hold on to her sanity. Eventually, her parents consulted Professor Charles Xavier. They didn't know that he was a mutant, and Xavier revealed to Jean, but not to her parents, that she was a mutant, and he protects her. In order to protect her, Xavier decided to block her intense telepathic abilities until she developed the maturity needed to handle them. He also assisted her in unlocking her potential as a telekinetic, teaching her how to levitate and manipulate objects with her mind. Years later, Jean would join Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, the cover that protected the X-Men, as the 5th and final member of the original 5, alongside Cyclops, Beast, Iceman, and Angel. Jean adopted the codename Marvel Girl in their early years of crime fighting. The early years of the original 5 X-Men are pretty standard crime-fighting shenanigans. They fought crime lords and terrorists, found mortal enemies in Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, fought the Sentinels, etc., etc. I'm not going to get into the time displacement stuff here because it is simply too much and I don't have the time, but just to give you an idea of how complicated Jean's life gets, there's a story where present as in circa Marvel 2012, Beast pulls the original 5 X-Men when they were kids to the present, so we then had young versions of the original 5 running around beside grown-up versions of themselves, except for Jean because present-day Jean was dead at the time. Like I said, it's a lot. But the next most important thing to pinpoint with Jean is the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix saga, which, again, is a lot. If you're familiar with the movies or cartoon, you probably know broad strokes of this story because they simply can't let go of trying to adapt this comic. I'm going to do my best to give the short of it here. Basically, on a mission re-entering Earth's orbit from space, the X-Men shuttle is falling apart. Jean uses her immense power to try to hold it together and protect the team, but she's going to die in the process. She feels the Phoenix Force, one of the oldest known cosmic entities in the Marvel Universe, reach out to her and offer assistance. She takes it. The Phoenix puts Jean in a cocoon at the bottom of the bay, unbeknownst to Jean or the X-Men at the time, while Phoenix absorbed a part of her consciousness, including her memories, to be able to physically reconstitute a body and take her place among the X-Men. To the rest of the team, Jean crashes into the bay, comes out of the water in a sick new outfit, and is proclaiming herself as Phoenix, because that is Phoenix. Phoenix then goes on living Jean's life. Eventually, Phoenix is manipulated by Mastermind, a telepath of the Hellfire Club, and the resulting psychological trauma sends Phoenix, still acting as Jean, on a rampage through the cosmos. It eventually absorbs the energy from an entire star, killing the inhabitants, 5 billion of them, of a nearby planet. Phoenix is pursued through space by the Shi'ar, demanding that Jean answer for her crimes. Phoenix, realizing it will always be at odds with its dark side, eventually commits suicide on the blue area of the moon. That is the incredibly abridged version of the Dark Phoenix saga. There is also a lot of romance stuff with Scott that comes into play later. There's always romance stuff with Scott that comes into play when it's dealing with Jean. Later, we're eventually introduced to the White Hot Room, a very ill-defined liminal space that's like post-death for hosts of the Phoenix Force, where Jean wakes up after she's been cocooned in the Bay. She has a conversation here with Delth itself, who tells her that her and the Phoenix are inextricably linked, essentially parts of the same whole, and that they always seek each other out. She's instructed to live and return to life, and a fragment of the Phoenix Force goes to Jean in the cocoon and tries to revive her, but Jean, feeling the memories of the Dark Phoenix saga, resists. This causes that fragment of the Phoenix Force to wander the globe, lost, and it eventually comes across the other major identity issue with Jean Grey, which is Madeline Pryor. Full disclosure, Madeline also could have been a perfect character choice to explore the themes of personal identity, but I'll probably save her for an episode that's more specifically diving into the philosophy of cloning, but that's a different topic. The need to know here, and God, it gets so complicated, so bear with me as I try to simplify it down, and just believe me when I say that there's some you don't need to worry about. Madeline Pryor was a failed clone of Jean Grey created by X-Men villain Mr. Sinister. He wanted a clone of Jean to mate with Scott Summers because he believes their offspring would be a perfect mutant, essentially. However, Sinister always failed to produce a clone of Jean that was equal to Jean. Madeline, for instance, did not develop any mutant abilities. However, when the fragment of the Phoenix Force that was rejected by Jean is wandering the planet, it finds the next best thing in Madeline and wakes her up. Now with mutant abilities, and then Sinister sets his plan in motion to seduce Scott via Madeline, and yeah. I'm going to do Maddie's story a bit of a disservice here, and I'm sorry to any Madeline Pryor fans who may be listening. Trust me, I love her a lot, but I simply don't have the time. So, Maddie and Scott form a relationship. There's a lot of drama because, well, she looks exactly like Jean, and Jean had just died. But things work out mostly. They end up having a child, Nathaniel Summers, who will grow up to be Cable, and they eventually go through some cosmic shenanigans, and Sinister's plan starts, and things go sideways. Maddie turns evil and loses her sense of self. She tries to take over the planet and turn it into hell on Earth. She's defeated, and baby Nathan gets sent into the future after he's infected by the techno-organic virus. In the middle of this, and slightly before, Jean is also returned to her body, and Scott learns of this and leaves Maddie and baby Nathan. This is part of the reason that Maddie turns evil. Look, I know, there's a lot here, but the main things that you need to know are that Maddie is a clone of Jean, they have some weird sense of self issues between the two of them, and eventually after this, their personalities and memories even get switched and combined. Jean literally ends up inheriting all of Maddie's memories of being married to Scott and having a baby with him because Phoenix and Maddie both end up in Jean as existing personalities simultaneously. And then Jean is able to purge their personalities but keep the memories, including those of her time as Dark Phoenix. So, again, it's a lot, I know. The important thing to take away here is that Jean's got some sense of self and identity problems for very good reason. She's had her mind wiped, combined, taken over, altered, and gone through many versions of herself. So with that semi-brief overview of Jean, let's dive into the philosophical side of the conversation after the break. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Negan.
And I'm Bree. Enjoying this show on the Aspect Network?
Then check out Viltrumikes, an Invincible podcast.
Each week, we go back and discuss your favorite episodes of the series and review new episodes as they release right on Amazon Prime.
Join us as we travel space, time, and the multiverse with Mark Grayson and discuss one of the most exciting superhero series on TV on Viltrumikes, here on the Aspect Network.
And now, back to the show.
Welcome back. So, personal identity is one of my favorite corners of philosophy, and before we get further, I'll go ahead and give a warning for possible anxiety-inducing thoughts upcoming. There's definitely a possibility for some existential dread or uncertainty or just general anxiety about the nature of your existence if you're prone to be anxious about that sort of thing. And also, before we really dive into things, I'm going to drop some recommended reading and cite some sources. As usual, I'm pulling a lot from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on personal identity. Other recommended readings include The Ego Tunnel, The Science of the Mind and the Myth of the Self by Thomas Metzinger, The Divided Self, An Existential Study in Sanity and Madness by R.D. Laing, and Being No One, The Self-Model Theory of Subjectivity, again by Thomas Metzinger. So, what is personal identity? Well, the problem of personal identity isn't a single problem, but rather a wide range of questions that are loosely connected. Generally, the term personal identity refers to the properties we feel a special sense of attachment to. My personal identity consists of the properties that I think make me, me. My feelings, belief, memories, etc. They define me as I am. Someone's personal identity, in this sense, is contingent and temporary. The way I define myself as a person might have been different and can vary from one point of time to another. I am not the same person from a personal identity perspective as I was 5, 10, or 15 years ago. What determines someone's personal identity in this sense is sometimes called the characterization question. It asks, in essence, who am I? We've also got the problem of personhood. What is it to be a person as opposed to a non-person? What do people have that non-people don't? For instance, what would it take for a computer to become a person if they ever could be? The most common answer is that to be a person is to have a certain special mental properties. Locke, for example, states that a person is, quote, a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, end quote. Others would argue a less direct criterion, arguing that a person is someone who is capable of achieving these criteria. Then we've got the question of persistence. What does it take for a person to persist from one time to another, to continue existing rather than to cease to exist? What sort of things make it possible for you to survive, and what sort of things necessarily bring about the end of your existence? What determines which past or future being is you? For example, if you point to a child in an old class photograph and say, "That's me," what makes you that one rather than any of the other ones? What makes it the case that anyone existing in the past is you? This is the problem of personal identity over time. It has to do with the question of whether the earlier and the later being are one thing or two. We've also got the problem of evidence. How do we find out who is who? What evidence shows whether the person here now is the one who was here yesterday? One of the most common sources of evidence is first-person memory. If I remember doing a particular action, I am the same person that committed said action. Then there's the physical evidence. If the person who did it looks just like you, or even better, is physically or spatio-temporally continuous with you, that too supports them being you. But which of these is more fundamental? Is one by itself sufficient evidence? Is one stronger than the other? Suppose that your memories are erased and replaced with accurate memories of the life of someone long dead. Abraham Lincoln, for example. Should we then conclude on the grounds of first-person memory that the resulting person is really Abraham Lincoln brought back to life? Or is it you because of the physical continuity of being? Which principle answers this question? Do either of them? So, as you can tell, there's a lot here and I'm just scratching the surface. One of my favorite quotes while researching for this episode is in response to questions of what we are. When discussing what we're made of on a material level, there are many different responses that philosophers have given over time. This response from Bertrand Russell made me laugh. He says, quote, "There is nothing that we are, we don't really exist at all," end quote. While not the most cheery, I think it's funny in that it gets to, in my opinion, what is at the heart of debates about personal identity. There aren't really any true discernible answers we can fish out here. There's a lot of things that may seem to work or make sense. Hume, for instance, argues that, quote, "We are collections of mental states or events, bundles of perceptions," end quote. So, as I was saying, there's a lot here. This is one of my favorite areas of philosophy because I think there are so many fascinating thought experiments that you can get from it. The quote, "memory chain," end quote, explanation for the persistence of personhood over time is an interesting avenue. It comes forward because people, rightly, argue that first-person memory isn't enough to justify a continuity in personal identity. For example, you don't remember when you were born or likely your first couple of years of life, but you would, in most cases I would imagine, like to argue that the baby version of you is still you. That's where the memory chain comes into play. It posits that if you can remember a you from last week doing something, and that you from last week can remember you from a month ago doing something, and so on, that is enough to constitute a persistence of personhood. It makes sense, and it feels comforting to some extent. It all gets a little messy when you start to try to really nail things down, though. Other thought experiments present different problems. Say that you're put into a device that breaks you down on a molecular level, reconstitutes you on the same molecular level, including all of your mental properties, in a similar device on Mars. Is the you on Mars the same as the you who was broken down on Earth? What if the machine on Earth reconstitutes you again on Earth while the you on Mars continues to exist? Are there now two of you? Just one of you? If there's only one of you, which is the original you and which is the new you? Neither of them? Both of them? Similarly, say that you walk into a forest and get struck by lightning. The lightning strike breaks you down on, again, a molecular level and reconstitutes you as a new person, but with all of your mental properties and the exact same physical properties. This reconstituted you walks out of the forest, none the wiser that there was any transformation at all, and no one in your life knows anything about it either. Is the you who walks out the same as the you who walked in? What if you argue that the original you would have made different life choices than the new you who emerges from the forest? The questions are endless. So now that I've hopefully got your head spinning a little bit, and that you're also hopefully thinking about how this all might apply to Jean Grey, let's shift the conversation back to her after the break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, to tie things back to Jean, I think a lot of her experiences and how they can be examined through the lens of personal identity kind of speak for themselves. She was taken over, replaced by a cosmic entity of unlimited power. That entity then acted in her stead, and you could argue that it wasn't Jean herself that committed the actions of Dark Phoenix, but it has also been established that Jean and the Phoenix are essentially one, or at least parts of the same whole. So, was it really not Jean as Dark Phoenix? Where do we draw the line? Jean ends up with all of her memories of her time as Dark Phoenix. Is that sufficient evidence to say that she was Dark Phoenix? Moreover, Dark Phoenix started with all of Jean's memories to begin with. Does that continuity of first-person memory not make Dark Phoenix Jean at the beginning? Would Jean not have made the same choices in the same circumstances that Dark Phoenix does? Dark Phoenix was also under the manipulation of outside forces, like telepathic control and manipulation from Mastermind. Does that not make it Dark Phoenix's responsibility for her actions? Is Jean post-Dark Phoenix morally responsible for Dark Phoenix's actions? Jean was influenced by a cosmic entity. Does that change who she is as a person pre-Phoenix? She's died, existed in a liminal space between life and death, and been reborn a handful of times. Is the Jean that is reborn a different Jean from the Jean pre-death? Is she different each time? Is she the same? What makes her the same or a different new person? Is it all the same person? If so, what makes her the same person throughout? Is it one unified body? Can it be if that body has been literally destroyed and remade? On a metaphorical level, is her transformation through Phoenix and Dark Phoenix an example of personal growth and maturity? Does she learn more through each experience and become a new, better person? I would argue on the whole, at least for this question, yes. She's constantly evolving and adapting, and especially in modern times is always trying to make up for the harm that she caused as Dark Phoenix. Can she ever make up for that harm? That's more a question of moral responsibility, but it veers into questions of personal identity because is she even the same person who caused that harm? Without a question, it's clear to see that she has gone through intense physical and psychological transformation in her history, which can be literalized through the various costumes and stages of Phoenix. She's not a stranger to a classic existential crisis. She goes through these and they can be seen as chances for rebirth, renewal, and a struggle to maintain a consistent sense of self. Does Jean have agency in her choices? As I've already mentioned, she's been influenced by a myriad of external forces, from psychic manipulation to a cosmic entity choosing her as a host. Does she still maintain agency among these external factors? Also, it's important in this discussion in the amount of internal trauma she's faced. She's from an incredibly young age and all throughout her life. She's the strongest telepath in the Marvel Universe, bar none, and that has brought with it a ton of trauma. Does she still have agency on her own? I would argue that's a strong yes. She does her best to maintain a sense of self and make decisions that are her own, overcoming the external and internal factors influencing her. What about her memories? What about Madeline Pryor? Is Maddie Jean? Is Jean Maddie? How do the two work out their mishmash of memories and decide where one ends and the other begins? Is Maddie an independent person different from Jean? I think the answer to this one is categorically yes. They share different bodies and have been shown to act very differently, and Maddie has lived her own life and made her own choices. Still, the connection between the two is one that's fraught with questions of what makes a person when it comes to cloning. The beginning of the Krakoan era, for instance, refused to resurrect Maddie on the basis that she was a clone, not an original person. This was eventually overruled, granting Maddie personhood, rightly so. Looming over this, though, is the factor of Jean's memories. Like I discussed earlier, she inherited the memories of both Maddie and Phoenix. Are those memories now hers? Do they make up who she is as a person? How do they contribute to her sense of self, to a coherent through line of self-identity? Where does one stop and the other begin, if they do at all? They're impossible questions piled on top of impossible questions, and it's something that I think the character will always be grappling with. It's part of what makes her so fascinating and enduring. Her fight to maintain that personal identity, to find agency, to act as Jean Grey is part of what keeps her going. I could go on for hours probably, but I think I'll wrap things up there. Is Jean Grey Phoenix? Now and forever. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, only Jean can tell you that. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Philosophy of X, and be sure to bring your umbrella next week as we dive into storm and environmental ethics. You can find me online at APBatman with 2 T's, and please be sure to subscribe here to The Aspect on YouTube and any platform where podcasts can be found. Please give us a like, leave a comment, and turn on that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on Twitter/X, Instagram, and TikTok at The Aspect Co. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.